Okay, good evening, everybody. We're back. Just a commercial note. Next Wednesday, I will not be here. I'm going to be out of town. So we will not be having class next Wednesday. 2 Wednesdays from now, Bezrat Hashem, I'll be back and we'll be ready to roll. We are at the bottom of what's called Daf Ches Amud Aleph, 8a. If you're following along in an art scroll Gemara, it would be 8a4. That's Hey, Vav, Zayin Ches, which is fascinating how fast we're moving through this. Actually, even I'm impressed. Okay, what we're in the middle of talking about here, to backtrack just a little bit, is we're going through a series of Mishnayot in the first chapter of Megillah. We're in the tractate Megillah, which is ostensibly the laws and the story of Purim. That's ostensibly what this tractate is supposed to be about, what this Masechta is supposed to be about. However, like in most instances in the Gemara, you get a lot of digressions because of associations. Every one of us has played the game of association in our life, where you're in the middle of a conversation, or you're sitting around with people and you're talking, and then an hour into the conversation, you wind up on a topic, and somebody turns to the other guy and goes, "How did we get on this topic?" Right? And you don't even remember how you got from thing to thing, right? Well, the authors of the Mishnah and the authors of the Gemara also did this. There's only one difference. When they did it purposefully. We do it absentmindedly because we're not really paying attention to what's going on around us. And most of us go through life completely absentmindedly, but that's a topic not for tonight's class. Okay? So, but our sages did this purposefully and with intent. And again, remember, because what's happening here is the recording of what's called Torah Sheba Al Peh, the oral Torah. So because of that, I can't believe it. Molester Schleppen. Yeah, please. No, it's not on the beamer? Where is it? Okay, wherever it is. That's not my phone. It's his phone. He leaves it here all the time. This Chaim Dean left it here. Okay, great. That's his thing. He'll be back. Okay. That one. So as we were saying, see, I told you it's very raw here. Okay? So the sages of the Mishnah and the Gemara, they go through things because it's the oral Torah, so they have association also. And since they're trying to remind themselves and keep everything recorded to memory, so when they think of a topic, they create an association to other topics that they're able to talk about. And that way they remind themselves, that way it's recorded. That's on the practical level. Of course, on the mystical level, everything that's going on over here that looks like a digression from the original topic is never a digression. Everything is purposeful. There's a meaning, an underlying meaning of why this is the topic that came up. Now, so what we're going through right now is a very famous sugya that's referred to amongst Talmud students as the Ein Bains. It started off with a Mishnah. I'm just reminding everybody, catching everybody up, okay? It started off with a Mishnah that said, Ein Bain, there's no difference between the first Adar and the second Adar, other than the reading of the Megillah. So in a leap year where there's two Adars, even though the first Adar, and practically what we have today is what we call Purim Katan, the small Purim in the first Adar, and the second Adar we celebrate the full Purim. And that's what the Mishnah told us, and then the Mishnah analyzed that. Once it started talking about that there's no difference between two things that look very similar, two things that seem very similar, there's no difference other than, that's the syntax of that Mishnah. There was no difference between first and second Adar other than reading of the Megillah. So the Mishnah now starts to digress, Mishnah after Mishnah, other things in the Torah that we can say, even though these two things are rather comparable, Ein Bain, there's no difference between this and that, other than. Okay? Now, we were in the middle of discussing last week that Ein Bain, there's no difference between a man has an emission. We talked about it. If you want to know all the background and the details, please go back to last week's class and watch it there on YouTube, and you'll get all the details. And there is what we call a small Zav. There's a Zav who has one emission versus two emissions versus three emissions. If he has only one emission, then it's a special kind of emission. It's generally all the modern halachot that try to translate this into English say that it's gonorrhea. That's the way they define it. Okay? I don't know. Baruch Hashem, I would know gonorrhea if it punched me in the face. Thank God. Okay? Thank God. So I don't really know what that is, but it's some sort of an emission. Okay. So the Mishnah said, so here's the biblical law, just quickly, briefly. If a man sees one of these emissions, and that's it, he goes to the mikveh, and that night he's pure again. If he sees two of them one day and then the next day, one day after the other, after that, then it becomes more serious, and he now has to count 7 clean days and then go bring a korban. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff, Metam Mishka v'Moshe, which is what the Mishnah talked about, what the Gemara started talking about, etc. If he sees it 3 days in a row, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, not only does he have to count 7 clean days after it's over, he also has to bring sacrifice at the end of the 7 days. So that's the 3 levels of Zav, what we call Zav. That's what we're referring to. And the Mishnah had stated that the only difference between a Zav who sees 2 and a Zav who sees 3 is karbanot. That the one who sees 2 has to count 7 days, the one who sees 3 has to count 7 days, and the only real difference between them is whether or not they have to bring a sacrifice. That was what the Mishnah had said. The Gemara got into a whole discussion. So Tuesday night I have a shiur, and Wednesday night I have a shiur. Both are broadcast on YouTube. What can't they find?
The confirmation you didn't send to 11.
I sent to one of the 11s. Did I send it to some other 11?
He sent it to one of you. Okay, sorry. Bye. I don't know.
Okay, let's continue. So here's what we ran into when we were analyzing this Gemara, this Mishnah. Some of it is logical, some of it is completely not logical. Now, when we say logical, the most simple logical argument that the Gemara ever applies is what we call a kal v'chomer. You remember that term from school? Kal means light, chomer means serious or stricter. And what we try to derive in a kal v'chomer, it's a simple logical approach. I understand it does have a Latin name, but the average person in law school still doesn't know what it means, even with the Latin words. It's called an a fortiori argument. Maybe I got that wrong. It's something like that, okay? Oh, and it's very, very simple. To give the simplest form of a kal v'chomer is Yom Tov, Chag, is not as strict as Shabbat, right? So for instance, because you can cook on Yom Tov, right? You can cook on Chag, but you can't cook on Shabbat, for instance, right? So Yom Tov is not as strict as Shabbat, so therefore Yom Tov is considered kal, lighter, easier, more lenient. Shabbat is called chomer, strict, more exacting. And so therefore, a kal v'chomer argument would be, and I'll let you finish the sentence for me, something that is prohibited on Chag, finish the sentence.
It's prohibited on Shabbat.
is for sure prohibited on Shabbat. You're struggling.
No, I understand. I'm just trying to see if there's anything I can identify that doesn't align with that.
And it would go the other way as well.
Right.
Something that is permitted on Shabbat should for sure be permitted on Chag. That's called a Kal V'chomer. It is the most basic of logical, there's lots of logical arguments in the Gemara, but the most basic universal logical argument in the Talmud is a Kal V'chomer. Nothing's more simple and nothing's more basic. Of course, the sages of the Talmud are great at taking such a simple and basic logical argument and making it complicated. And what's the easiest way to make that complicated? The easiest way to make it complicated would be the only way you can apply a Kal V'chomer argument is if the Kal in your argument, the lenient aspect, is always Kal. And the Chomer is always Chomer. Think about it. Because let's say you could find something ostensibly, let's use the argument, the simple argument that we presented. But let's say you could find something that was more lenient on Shabbat than it is on Chag. So now you can no longer apply Kal V'chomer. You can only apply a Kal V'chomer logical argument if the Chomer is always Chomer and the Kal is always Kal. Because otherwise the logic doesn't fit anymore. Now you just have rules. And the rules don't really tell you anything. Are you following this?
Mm-hmm.
If all of a sudden I find something in Shabbat that's more lenient than Chag, so now I can no longer make the argument that something that's permitted on Shabbat is for sure permitted on Chag, because here's something that's permitted on Shabbat, but it's prohibited on Chag. And the same thing in the reverse. If you could find something that's prohibited, well, it's the same concept in both ways, right?
Mhm.
So now you could no longer assume that anything that's prohibited on Chag is also prohibited on Shabbat, because we don't know. Because we have something else that is prohibited on Chag that is permitted on Shabbat. So a Kal V'chomer argument, in order for it to hold up, has to always be Kal and Chomer. And if you can show an exception to it, then your Kal V'chomer is gone, or at least struggling at best. And that's what the Gemara was doing over here. Because we're deriving from verses the various laws that apply, whether universal or differential, between a Zav who saw 2 versus a Zav who saw 3. And we've been deriving it from various verses in the Torah. And we have different sages deriving it from different verses. I'm just catching up to what we're holding now, okay? But the Gemara keeps asking, why did you need a verse to teach me this? For instance, let's apply it to what we're talking about. If a Zav who had 2 emissions is Tameh, then for sure a Zav who has 3 emissions is Tameh. And we have this law of Metame Mishkav U'Moishav. A Zav is a very unique, the Zav and Nida and Zava, these 3, and Metzora, have very, very unique laws. Someone who's Tameh can convey Tumah. But normally when you convey Tumah, it goes down a degree. It's like 7 degrees of separation. So that eventually, for instance, let's take it from a dead body. This is classic biblical law. A dead body we call Avi Avot HaTumah, the grandfather of Tameh, the highest level of Tumah. So now a human being who comes in contact with a dead body, he himself is considered an Av HaTumah, a father of Tumah, which is a different, and he has to go through, for instance, 7 days of purification.
The definition of tumah is just impure.
Impurity, yes, spiritual impurity. Okay? So such a person who came in contact with a dead body is not allowed to enter into the Beit HaMikdash. This is why the Kohen is prohibited from coming in contact with dead bodies, because the Kohen has to always be ready to go into the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. How can a person who came in contact with a dead body come and go back into the Beit HaMikdash? That's the red heifer. We probably all remember that one, right? There's a special red heifer that special laws to it that ultimately gets slaughtered, burnt to ashes, and you have to mix those ashes with pure water and sprinkle it on the guy. And he has to go through a 7-day process. On the 3rd and 7th day of that process, he gets sprinkled with the ashes, mixed with the purified water. And then at the end of the 7 days, he goes to the mikveh. And then at that night, he can now go back into the Beis HaMikdash. Okay? That person, during the duration of his impurity, including the 7 days of his going through the cleansing process, he is called Av HaTumah, father of Tumah. Now, what happens when he touches something or touches another person? So now the next person is 2 degrees separated from the dead body. So the person he touches does not become, or kalim or food, etc., all these things. That person does not become an Av like him. That person becomes what we call a Rishon Tumah, a first level of Tumah. Av and Avi Avot, father and grandfather, are called main Tumah. Everything below is called lesser Tumah. Biblically, there's really only a Rishon. Our sages added Sheni, Shlishi, and maybe even in some cases Revi'i. In other words, the Rishon touches something, it becomes a Sheni. The Sheni touches something, it becomes a Shlishi, etc. Only applies to Truma. Not important to tonight's discussion, so therefore let's not go into those details. Okay? Not on our topic. But that's the way Truma is normally conveyed. The Zav, who we're talking about here tonight, he conveys Truma in a completely different way. Not only what he touches becomes Tameh like him, but everything it touches. So an example, classic example given in the Torah and in the Gemara. You have a couch that has multiple pillows piled up on it. Or you have a garage, you got 5 mattresses piled up in the garage. And the Zav sits down on the top mattress. This is a unique law to the Zav, the Zava, the Nida, and the Mitzorah. He sits down on that top mattress. All the mattresses become Rishon. We don't say the top mattress he touched becomes a Rishon. The second mattress underneath that, which touched the first mattress, because he never touched the lower mattresses. He only touched the top one, right? Got it? He only lied down or sat down on the top one.
Is it true of Nida also?
Huh?
Is it also true of Nida?
Yes.
So how do we deal
It
with
doesn't apply. The reason it doesn't apply in today's day and age is because we're all Av HaTumah.
Oh.
So coming in contact with a Nida doesn't make us any more We're already all Tumah in a higher level of Tumah.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, what does Zav and all these other terms mean?
Zav, we said, is the man who's having these emissions.
Oh.
That's the Zav. That's what we're talking about. Okay? I'm sorry if I didn't repeat that. No, that's fine.
What's Zava?
Thank you for asking. Zava would be the female equivalent. The difference between a Zav and a Zava is a Zav's emission, the Torah says, is white. The Zava's emission is red. It's like blood. But their laws are the same. Just the male, it's okay.
Zava and Nida are not the same.
No, they aren't. But in today's, our sages instituted that when a woman goes through her menstrual cycle, we apply the stricter laws of Zava, not the laws of Nida, because Nida has different laws than Zava does. The Zava has to count 7 clean days. The Nida only has to count 7 days.
Mm.
So, for instance, a Nida, let's say if it's her pure menstrual cycle, biblically, so let's say her menstrual cycle lasts 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, let's say. So then she starts counting 7 days from the first day of her cycle. And at the end of 7 days, since her cycle is already over, she can go to the mikveh. That's a Nida. A Zava has to wait till the end of her cycle and then first start counting 7 clean days, just like the Zav needs to do as well. Got it? So our sages in the Gemara instituted that all menstrual emissions in a woman are treated as Zava. So today, all women have to count 7 clean days after their cycle is over, even if they have a steady cycle, even if they, whatever, etc.
So, what I understand is that tumor results with the loss of life from one point A to point B, right? Is there a greater loss of life with the Zala and Anita as Zala Zala?
The concept of the loss of life is an explanation. It is not the explanation.
So it applies mostly to most contaminations, right? The idea of that concept. Does it apply here? I mean, I would imagine it applies even more here because since the tumors are even greater.
Why not? Okay. So the Zav or the Zava, either one, the man or the woman going through this, whatever it is, this unusual emission, everything they touch becomes tameh, impure, all the way through. That's called metame mishkavu moshav. It makes tameh where he lies down or anything he sits on. But that only starts after the second emission. If the man only has the first mission one time Zav, he doesn't have the law of metame mishkavu moshav. Only after the second emission does he have it. And of course, after the third emission, and because after the second emission, that's when the 7 days kick in. That's when all these extra levels of impurity kick in. And then after the third emission, he has the carbon too. So the Gemara has been going through a whole discussion of which things should we add, because the Mishnah started off and said the only difference between 2 and 3 is the carbon, the sacrifice. So the Gemara is going through which are the things that they parallel, that they're exactly the same. And then where do we get it from? So then we start to go through verses in the Torah. So then the Gemara says, really, do I need a verse for this? It's obvious, right? If this applies to the law of 2, it for sure should apply to the law of 3. A Kal V'chomer argument. Then the Gemara goes, no, because you have, by a woman, it's different. So the Gemara goes back and forth on that, and that's really where we're holding. And we're deriving from the word mizovo, from his zav status. And it appears twice in the Torah in 2 different verses. And the word mizovo seems to be superfluous in both of those verses. So the Gemara is deriving from the word mizovo that not all laws are applicable to all zavim. And so therefore there's going to be some things that are going to apply here, some are going to apply there. That's really where we're holding. Okay? We are, again, at the bottom of 8a. Oh, that was an introduction. Wow. Okay. So we're at the bottom of 8a. We'll go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines from the bottom. The third word on the line. V'hashta, and now, the amrit that you said, mizovo l'drasha, that the word mizovo is used to derive a new teaching from it, the extra word. I'll bring you another verse where the same extra word appears, and I'm going to ask you, what's going on there? The next verse is v'chiyitar azov mizovo, when the zav will cleanse himself, will purify himself from his zav status. Okay? So that word mizovo is completely superfluous. The verse only could have said v'chiyitar azov, when the zav will purify himself. Obviously, he's purifying himself from his zav status. So the Torah put an extra word there. So now the Gemara is going to say, if you derived something from the word mizovo. In the other verse, then this superfluous word mizovo must be teaching us something as well. What does it teach us? My drashas pay. What are you going to learn from that one? So the Gemara says, that one, that extra mizovo, mi boile, we need it, lekidetanya, for that which is taught in another braita, another rule. I think I pointed this out before. It's worth repeating. The word we learned, something we learned in another place. The Gemara uses the word. There's 3 words to say we learned. Tnan, Tanya, Itmar. It's a good rule to know when you're learning Gemara. If the Gemara says Tnan, we learned, and uses the word Tnan, that means it's quoting a Mishnah, an actual explicit Mishnah. If it says Tanya, that means it's quoting a Braita, which we said in our introductory class to this Gemara. Braita is also Tanaic teachings, but were not incorporated into the Mishnah. We talked about that before in previous classes. If it says Itmar, we learned that it's quoting another Amoraic authors of the Gemara teaching.
It's not in the Gemara.
It's coming from another teacher of the Gemara that we're really incorporating here. It could be in another place in the
Oh,
Gemara.
it might still be in there.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Okay? So that's how you'll know. Whenever you see it quoting something, if the quote says Tanan, that means it's quoting from a Mishnah. If it says Tanya, it's quoting from a Braita. If it says Itmar, it's quoting from another Amoraic teaching. Okay. So the Gemara says, what do I need the word mizovo in the second verse? Hahu mi boile, that was needed, l'kidetanya, for the teaching that we learned in a Braita. What does that Braita say? V'chiyiter hazav. When the Zav will come to purify himself, l'chashiyis yifsoik mizoivoi. When his Zav, when his emission flow will come to an end. Mizoivoi v'loi mizoivoi v'nigoi. Okay? We learn from this that if the Zav also had Saras, he does not have to be cleansed. You know what Saras is? Okay. It's not really leprosy. We use the word leprosy to translate it. But Saras was a biblical disease that looked like leprosy. That's what it looked like. And since we don't have another word for it in English, we use the word leprosy. But it wasn't really leprosy. It was usually skin lesions. There was also, it could be tsaras on a person's clothes. It could be a tsaras on his house. It looks like a fungal infection. Yeah. It came as a punishment for Lashon Hara, the Gemara says. Okay? So now if a person had tsaras and he was a zav at the same time,
Hey, what a combo.
right?
Burn his house down.
Yeah, this guy's he's been living a hard life. Drinking, lashon hara, messing with the wrong people. Sheesh. Okay. Anyway, so if a guy has both zav and tsaras at the same time, so maybe I'm going to say that even though his zav stopped, he stopped having the emissions, since he's already tameh as a metzora, which also makes him unclean, right? And the metzora also has to count 7 days once the tsaras is healed. So maybe he can't start counting 7 days. Because even though the zav may have stopped, but the tsaras is still there. So along comes the Torah and says, V'chi yitar hazav, when the time will come that he will no longer be having zav emissions. Mizovo, the extra word tells you that the person can start counting his 7 days, even though his teras is not yet healed. Got it? That's what the extra word has come to tell you. He can start counting the 7 days, even though his teras isn't healed yet. Okay. Then the Torah has another word, v'safar. He will start to count. Mizoy v'safar. Limed al zov bal shtei riyos. This comes to teach you that a zov who only had 2 emissions, Shaton Sfira Shiva, he already has to start counting 7 days. Okay. So now the Gemara says, again, we're going to try to apply a Kal V'chomer. V'haloi dinhu. This is a logical argument. The Gemara uses the word din. Normally we call that judgment. But the Gemara uses the word din to say Kal V'chomer. When it says din, it means Kal V'chomer. V'haloi dinhu, this is a Kal V'chomer. Im mitam imishkevu moshav. If a person who has 2 emissions already is in a high level of impurity, high enough that when he sits down on the top mattress, all the mattresses become tamei, right? La yehi ton svida shiva. Shouldn't he for sure have to count 7 days? If his level of impurity is so high that he now makes everything he touches impure all the way through, then for sure he's at such a high level of impurity that he needs 7 clean days, right? Kal v'chomer. Along comes the Gemara and says, no, your Kal v'chomer doesn't work. Why? And now we're on 8b1. You can't derive it logically. Why? Shemeres yoim keneged yoim techiach. This will be broken by a woman who's counting 1 day after the other. Different than the man, the woman has 2 types of zav or zava in the feminine. Okay, this is what we call zava ktana and zava gedola. Small, minor zava versus major zava. A woman so let's talk about this classically. Classically, biblically, a woman has a cycle. Her cycle should be very, very regulated. The truth is, women today have most women have very regulated cycles. Most women do have. But again, today we apply Zava laws to everything. Okay? Today we apply Zava laws to everything. But let's talk in biblical times. A woman has a very regulated cycle, so when her cycle comes, she's called Nida. And like we said, at the end of 7 days, she can go to the mikveh. After that, she has 11 days that should be clean. That's a normal cycle. After those 7 days, she should have 11 days that should be for sure clean. If she sees blood during those 11 days, biblically, this does not have halachic application today. The halachic application in practical is completely different than what I'm saying to you now. Okay? If she sees blood during those 11 days, that blood is called zava.
The minor.
So if she sees it once, it's minor zava. Hi. If she sees it once, it's called minor zava. Okay? What's the difference between minor and major? Minor zava, if she only sees it once, she goes to the mikveh that night and she's fine. Once it becomes major zava, she now has to count 7 clean days. So, a woman who, what?
7 clean days will probably put her back into Nina.
Yeah. That's one of the challenges. even today, it's one of the challenges of fertility. Women who struggle with fertility very often, it's because their cycle is off. Couples run into a real problem because this is really an aside that has nothing to do with tonight's class, but it's just an interesting aside. One of the problems that frum couples run into with fertility is that if a woman's cycle is very off, then her ovulation night often can come out during her 7 clean days.
So you can't really spot it.
Wow. Is it?
That happens. That's usually like a frum couple is trying to have kids, and there's a problem. She's not becoming pregnant. That's usually the first thing medically that they'll try to address to figure out if it's off. There's easy tests to find that out medically, very, very simple tests that are non-intrusive, etc. But even without that, obviously, if a woman has a very short cycle in general, if she's running in the low 20s, the average woman is in the high 20s or in the 30s. That's what's considered average. 30 days, the Gemara considers an average cycle. So if a woman's in the high 20s or in the early 30s, that's usually, she should be fine ovulation-wise. But if she's in the low 20s, she could run into possibly that her ovulation is during her 7 days of counting clean days. So she can't be with her husband then, and that sometimes is the problem of why they're not able to become pregnant. Sometimes that's the issue. And that's, by the way, today with modern medicine, very easily adjusted, if that's the problem. That can easily be fixed if that's the problem. The point, but you're right, it does sometimes, right? So sometimes a woman, and the Rambam, of course, who loves complicated math, who loves to make your head spin with the math, in these laws, when he goes through these laws, he goes through them in very exhaustive, that a woman could go 7 days nida, 3 days clean, 1 day zava, skip a day, and then have another day zava, and then all of a sudden it's and then it sets her off into nida again, and now we don't know what she's supposed to be doing. Yeah. Yes, it can get very complicated. Yeah. But we're going to try to keep it simple. So during those 11 days, we are not expecting her to see any menstrual blood. If she does, we automatically call that zava. If she sees it once, it's called zava ktana. And she is what's called, the Gemara calls it, shomeret yom keneged yom. She's counting, checking day by day. Because if she has one and then she skips a day, let's not complicate this. Shomeret yom keneged day, she's waiting for a clean day. If she has only one emission, right, then she's waiting for one clean day, and she goes to the mikveh. That's a shemeres yom keneged yom. Now we call that person a zava ktana. And she doesn't have to count 7 days, right? But she is mitama mishkav umoshav. She's automatically called a zava, by contrast to a man. A little bit different, the rules between zava and zava. But she is mitama mishkav umoshav even after only one blood emission. So she's only counting 1 day. She doesn't have to count 7 days. But she already has the law that when she sits on a bed, the impurity goes all the way through. So we've just ruined our kal v'chomer. Our kal v'chomer was if somebody makes all the mattresses tamei, impure, then for sure you should have to count 7 days. But the woman who only has one emission makes all the mattresses tamei and she doesn't count 7 days. Kal v'chomer has now been destroyed, right? That's why I gave you the whole introduction, so that you'd be able to follow it when you come to it here in the Gemara. Did you all get that?
Yes.
Okay. If your head is spinning, let me know. I tried to make it as clear so that we'll be able to, right? We got it. Okay, good. By the way, if any of you have just fainted, send me a text. So she doesn't have to count 7 days. And continues the Gemara. Don't let it surprise you that the Zav who had 2 emissions, that even though the Zav who's had 2 emissions, remember it's different, the Zav versus the Zavah, okay? The Zav who's had 2 emissions, who now makes unclean all the mattresses, maybe it doesn't require him to keep 7 clean days. So unless you had an explicit verse telling you that the guy who had only 2 emissions still has to count 7 days, if you didn't have a verse telling you that, you wouldn't know it on your own. You could not derive it from logic. That's what the Gemara is saying. You brought in a verse to teach you that. And the question was, why do I need a verse? Why don't we derive it from logic? So the Gemara said, logic's not going to work over here. Kal v'chomer logic's not going to work because you have the woman who saw only 1 and she makes everything impure and she doesn't have to count the 7 days. That okay? That's where we are. Talmud Levin, that's why the verse comes to tell us, mizovo, v'safar. That's why the Torah tells us both words, that mixas zovo v'safar, that mizovo, that there's some people who become a zov, they still have to count. Lime, this comes to teach you a zov bal shtei riyos, that a zov who saw 2 emissions, sheton, sfidas shiva, he needs to count 7 days. Okay. So now the Gemara has a problem, because we had 2 mizovos, right? But the first one we didn't talk about tonight. We only get jumped in at the second one. But the first mizovo excluded something. The second mizovo added something. In Gemara syntax, that's a little bit of a challenge. If you're using the same word and its superfluousness and its conjugation within its superfluousness to derive something, usually you either use it to exclude or you use it across the board to include. But here we have 2 words, exactly the same words, with exactly the same conjugation, with the same syntax, but in one case we're going to add something as a result of it, and in the other case we're going to exclude something. So now the Gemara wants to know, why did you do that? In other words, the fact that this extra word needs to teach you something, I get it. But usually, if it's going to teach you something, we do it across the board. But here you're not doing it across the board. You're not using it across the board to exclude. You're also not using it across the board to include. So there has to be a rule or a reason why in one instance you used it to be inclusive, and in the other instance you used it to be exclusive. Why? That's the Gemara's next question. So the Gemara says, Rav Papa Abaye. So Rav Papa said to Abaye, we are on the first wide line. That's the way we call it in Gemara language. The first wide line. What's different about this word mizoivoi? That it marbez bay, that we add in the law a zav bal shtei riyos, a zav who's had 2 emissions. What's different in this other word, mizovo, in the other verse, the memayed beisav bal shtei riyos, where we're going to exclude a zav who had 2 emissions. Okay? So along comes Rav Abaye and answers, Amalei. So Abaye responds, and he says, if your thought would be that this second verse comes to exclude, then the verse should have said nothing. And we would have automatically, had the verse not mentioned the words from his emission altogether, we would have no reason to include a Zav who experienced only 2 emissions in the requirement to count 7 days. Just leave it out. When the Zav wants to, so in other words, the extra word mizovo would not be needed to teach us no about someone who sees 2 emissions. It's only needed to teach us yes. So the Torah would have just left the word out in the first place, not to teach us that. Amalei, he says, I'm sorry, this is coming right. Are you going to say asimidina that you could have derived it from a Kal Vachomer Shemeres Yom Tov? We already had that. We disproved the Kal Vachomer with the Zava of 1 day, the Zava Ktana. Maybe you need it that he can cleanse himself. He can start to count from his Zav emission, but not from his tzaras, his leprosy. And then the verse should have said, when the Zav goes to cleanse himself, can be quiet. So it forces us to say that it comes to teach us that a Zav who has 2 emissions has to count 7 days. And with that, we concluded this extraordinarily complicated piece of Gemara. Knotty, Knotty. This is the kind of logical exegesis that a 9-year-old in yeshiva starts to sharpen his mind on.
That's amazing.
So by the time he's 14 or 15, he should be able. We had in the Torah portion a couple of weeks ago when Moshe Rabbeinu goes looking for who he should appoint as judges to work with him. And Hashem tells him he should look for Anosh. Yeah, we're going to stop here because I don't want to start the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah will start. We'll wait. Anoshim Chachamim Nevoinim Yeduim. Wise, understanding, and knowledgeable people. Rashi explains what are these 3 different characterizations. Rashi says Nevoinim is Mevin Davar Mitoch Davar. Being able to draw conclusions to things that be able to analyze something and draw conclusions that maybe extrapolate out, not in the box. In today's modern educational world, they call them HOTS, higher order thinking skills, HOTS, higher order thinking skills. Being able to bring out in kids higher order thinking skills. It's a powerful idea. The Gemara is supposed to do that to you. If it isn't doing, amongst other things, obviously, if the Gemara isn't doing that to you, there's something wrong with your teacher or something wrong with the way you're learning it. But the Gemara should do that to you. Okay? So the Torah says, Rashi says, Moshe Rabbeinu was looking for people who were nevoinim, mevin davar mitoch davar, can analyze something and draw other conclusions. What's interesting is that then Moshe says, that's what I was looking for. What did I find? Moshe says, I went and I got people anoshim chachamim v'yeduim. Rashi says, nevonim, Moshe couldn't find. He couldn't find them.
Nevonim are the Hawks in question?
Yes. He couldn't find such people. So when he went to appoint judges, he only was able to appoint wise and knowledgeable, but not nevonim. I would submit, I know a source for what I'm about to say, because Aaron usually likes to hear sources. Right. Because he was about to ask the question. That doesn't seem right.
No, you can find the most decent person.
It can't be that Moshe couldn't find Nevonim, right?
I mean, if you brought 10 people in front of him, okay, take.
How could it be amongst all the people that were in the desert he couldn't find Nevonim? Right? Good question. That was what you were about to ask?
I was confused.
Okay. Right.
At least just filled with the best applicants.
So I would submit he did, but they weren't Nevonim. Oh, he did fill it with the best. That's what he says. He says, I took the best applicants, okay? Like in university, marked on a curve. Which I don't understand what that means, but whatever. Well, let's not go digress, okay? I would submit that in order to be able to be Nevonim, you ready for this? You need real world experience. You want me to give you an example? For you, it's not going to be the best example, but I'll give you a different example. A guy goes to accounting school, okay? A guy goes to accounting school. So now he knows how to create a set of books. He knows how to look at a set of books. He knows how to make sure, he knows how to work Excel spreadsheet. He knows how to use Excel. He knows how to make comparative sheets in an Excel spreadsheet where if you change a number here, it changes 4 numbers over there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you know what he doesn't know necessarily? What doesn't he know? He has no idea what all these numbers mean. He has no idea what these numbers mean, right? So if he's not Nevonim, he can look at the spreadsheet and the bottom number at the bottom is in black. Depending on what kind of spreadsheet you're using, right? It either turns red when it's going the wrong way, and it's green, whatever color you're using, right? Okay, green. We'll use green as the example. The bottom number is green. Okay, everything's okay, right? But guess what? Things aren't okay. I'm right or am I right? Okay, right? Things aren't okay. But only someone who's Nevonim can look at that spreadsheet and realize that even though the last number on the sheet is green, things are not okay. You have to be Nevonim for that. And you know who's Nevonim? The person with real world experience. In most instances, it's usually not the CPA. It's usually not the CPA. It's usually the actual entrepreneur. He's the guy who has the real world experience. The CPA usually walks into the entrepreneur and goes, hey, I finished the quarterly books. We're doing great. And usually it's the entrepreneur who knows, not really. Not really. Things are not right. Things are not right. The company is not, we have excess inventory that you put in over here that didn't belong here. And that's the problem. And that's really where all our profits are, in the excess inventory. And maybe it looks green, but we're actually screwed. Yosef, I'm right or I'm right? Okay.
Very thorough.
Okay. Right? So it turns out, so I would submit, I don't have a source for this. I would submit that the reason why Moshe couldn't find Nevonim was because at that point in history, they had no real world experience yet. They were 40 years in a desert. They were living with manna from heaven, water from a rock, clouds of glory that protected them. There was no real world experience. Everything was theoretic. So the spreadsheets all matched. What's the problem? There was no reason, nothing compelled them. In other words, to me, real world experience is what forces you to actually use your Nevonim skill. Did you follow what I just said? That's what'll force you into a Nevonim skill. Real world experience is what's going to force you into an avonim skill. Okay, this is not a good example because they're all such filthy liars. Every single one of them, not one of them, not a word of truth comes out of their mouths. But politicians sit in Washington, D.C.
All right. It's going on YouTube, man.
Okay, I don't care. I can't call them all filthy liars. They wear that as a badge of honor. If he only called me filthy liar, I'm okay. Okay? Politicians sit in Washington and can sit there and pontificate about how, and this is not Republican versus Democrat, because they both do this. They both do this and tell you, life is great in America. Guess what? No, it isn't. Because you're sitting in your ivory tower in Washington, D.C., and you don't know that there's people struggling to make ends meet. People can't pay their grocery bills. People can't get an appointment with a doctor. People can't find housing, etc., etc., etc. But the person on the street, he is constantly trying to figure out how am I going to make it here. He's working it because he has no choice. How do I extrapolate? How do I take this and make it into this and make it into that so that it works? Now I'll end with if my theory is correct, I'll end with the following thought. The greatest tzaddikim in history did everything they possibly could to bring Mashiach. The Rebbe, of course, in the history of mankind, no one has come closer to bringing Mashiach in the practical sense as the Rambam describes it than what the Rebbe has done. If you look at the way the Rambam describes it, it reads like the Rebbe's resume. Okay? And yet the Rebbe said, I've done everything I can. I'm handing it over into your hands. Now you go out and finish the job. So, tiny little cockroaches like me, the initial reaction to that is, if the Rebbe said he couldn't bring Mashiach, I'm going to bring Mashiach. So the Rebbe himself explains it and says, no, it needs a bottom-up experience. It needs people who are in the trenches. The tzaddikim can't ultimately bring Mashiach. They could bring Mashiach top down, but the actual geula has to be a bottom-up experience. And so we become the Nevoinim. We're the ones that are stuck in the trenches. We're the ones, or to use the classic Torah terms, the tzaddik versus the Baal Tshuva. What the Baal Tshuva can achieve, the tzaddik can never achieve. And as we extrapolate to the geula through Mashiach, the tzaddikim can only bring Mashiach so far. The Baalei Tshuva are the ones that are really going to make it happen. So let's exercise our Nevonim skills and make sure we do it. Tonight it is customary from the 15th of Av to already wish each other K'tiva v'chatima tova l'shana tova u'matuka. May you be inscribed and sealed for your blessings, health, and happiness. And the most important blessing, a year of sweetness and goodness, the ultimate goodness, Ein Tova la Torah, the coming of Mashiach. May it happen now. Amen. Chaim, everybody, thank you so much for joining us this evening.